Hi, this is Mr. Miller, and here's a quick lesson on graph critique. So there are three parts to a graph critique. We want to critique these three elements. Element number one is the graph type. Element number two is the graph format. And element number three is the graph usefulness. Let's take a look at these things in detail. In order to critique the graph type, what you need to do is state whether the graph type is best suited for the situation. You also need to explain why or why not. So for more details on this, you can go back to your notes that are entitled Best Use for Each Graph Type, and that will help to remind you what each graph type is for. The second thing you need to critique is the graph format. What you need to do is make a statement about whether the format makes the graph a true representation or if it's misrepresenting the data, making it misleading. There's going to be more details on that a little bit later, but for now, remember that whenever you make a statement, you also want to justify your statement. And the third element to a graph critique is to take a look at the graph usefulness. What you want to do is identify if the graph has all the elements that make it informative. The key elements that make it informative are these things. A clear title. And we talked about this in class. A clear title is sometimes kind of a long title, right? Because you want to be really specific about where the data is coming from. You also want to make sure that both axes are labeled, the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. And finally, you may need a legend in certain situations. We use a legend when we're making a double or triple bar graph, or if you're making a triple line graph or a double line graph. In other words, when you have more than one set of data, you need to put a legend in to indicate which data points are coming from where. Now, a really good graph will help you to illustrate some kind of a point. And so if the graph doesn't clearly make a point, then it may not be all that useful. That's another thing that you want to think about when you're doing a graph critique. Now let's take a look at misrepresenting the data. There are two ways we can do this. Number one is you can distort the scale, and number two is that you can distort the visuals. Here's what distorting the scale looks like. Notice that these two graphs are exactly the same data. Now there's no lying here, right? The difference is that it's misleading in how it looks. It looks here like company B is selling, man, about 3 times as much as company A. Now that's not really the case. If you take a look at this graph, which is more of a true representation, it looks like company B is selling about 10% more than company A. And that's a more realistic comparison. So why does it seem like there's such a big difference here? Well, the reason is because the scale is not starting from 0. So when you're starting from somewhere above 0, or if you have a break in the vertical axis, that can really exaggerate the difference between these two categories, or these two companies that are being compared. Notice that this scale is starting from 0 going up to the maximum number and going in equal increments, so it has a much more realistic representation of the relative size of sales for these two companies. So, distorting the scale often means that there's been a break in the scale. A break in the scale is usually done on the vertical axis for vertical bar graphs. If it was a bar graph that was done horizontally, then the scale is on the horizontal axis. And it can be misleading because it may not represent the relative size of each category accurately. And in the case of a line graph, it may not represent the relative changes over time very accurately. Here's another way to misrepresent the data with distorted visuals. Notice that these two graphs have exactly the same data. It seems in this graph like company B is selling about twice as much as company A, when in fact they're only selling about 10% more. The reason for that is because this bar is not only taller, but it's also wider, when really all we should be doing is making the bar taller. So distorting the visuals involves either using bars of different widths for a bar graph, or, well, that's pretty much it. This is misleading because it gives the wrong impression about the relative size of these categories. So that wraps up this lesson on graph critique. I hope that this makes sense for you. One thing that you should keep in mind, just a final thought here, is that graph critique doesn't mean that you have to say something negative. Some people have the wrong idea about critique. Critique can actually be a good thing. But if you're going to talk about the good parts of a graph, you have to justify and say what is good about it and why you believe that it's a good graph. If you're going to give criticism, if you're going to say something negative, then you also have to justify your statement. So either way, it can be positive or negative, but you do have to justify your statements. Thanks for watching and have a great day.